Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and welcome back to our good friend Harley Schlanger. Harley's been doing a little traveling, been participating in the very important conference over the weekend, and joins us from on the road in North Carolina today. So, Harley, thanks for being with us, and welcome.
Well, John, it's nice to see you and be able to talk with your viewers. And I have to say, it's interesting being back in the United States. The first thing I noticed is the inflation. The price of food is really high from what I remember, including restaurants. It's somewhat staggering. We have inflation in Germany, but not as high as I've seen so far in the U.S.
Wow. Well, they seem to keep the gas prices down so people don't complain, but that may be an election issue. I don't know, though. It seems to be kind of everybody's just accepting that after, pouring all that money into vaccines and things and the war that we keep pouring our treasure into, the various wars, I should say, is obviously going to, and as long as they keep printing money, well, I mean, what are we going to do? That's I guess that is one of the political issues when you think about Trump's campaign.
Well, neither of the candidates have a legitimate solution to it because the solution is, I mean, Trump does say we're not going to spend as much on wars, which would be an important step forward. But taking the power away from the central bank, from the Federal Reserve, which operates as an instrument of the private banks, the too big to fail banks. One of the reasons for inflation is they're allowing these banks to keep on their books the inflated face value of corporations and debt that can't be redeemed, is not fungible. And as a result, they have to pour more money into it, and that's the cause of inflation. But I mean, paying $20 for a cheeseburger and $23 for a chicken wrap
Whoa.
in an airport restaurant.
Airports are different, though.
Well, but then when we went to restaurants otherwise, the prices were much higher than I remember. And on a working man's salary from Europe, it's kind of hard to stay afloat.
I have always considered that as one of the amazing things about Europe, because of course, I've had various short trips to Europe, and I always felt that most people around were fairly comfortable and not unhappy with their lives. But at the same time, if you look at the salaries, they weren't making a whole lot of money by American standards, and a lot of them, were able to get by without having a car, for instance, and that kind of a lifestyle was actually appealing, especially in a cultural center that I really cherish to be in. And so that image of Europe, I think, has just died away with all of the well, you've described the infrastructure yourself.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of quality of life, there seemed to be when I first moved to Germany, even just 7 years ago, you had no problems with connecting anywhere on continental Europe by train. Now the German train system is a real risk and a gamble.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. The trains are late. The Pünktlichkeit, the being on time, seems to be a lost virtue with the younger generation.
Oh,
But
no.
also, they don't have adequate manpower for the rail system. And so I was on a train that stopped midway between Frankfurt and Munich. It was supposed to be a straight through run. It stopped because two of the people running the train got sick and they had no replacements available. So we had to wait for another train, which was 2 hours away, to pick us up. And then there were no seats. So you had to sit on the floor.
Oh,
So, and this is a not uncommon experience. So and part of the reason is the money's not there for redundancy, to have surplus manpower, whether it's for logistics, for scheduling, for on-train services, because the money is going instead to the war.
Right.
Billion euros to Ukraine. And for what? For what purpose? How does Germany benefit? In fact, Germany is making itself a target. And if the Germans don't change this commitment to accepting U.S. Missiles, nuclear capable missiles to be deployed in 2026, Germany will definitely be a target. So I think if people in the United States knew this idea of the bucolic beauty, the majesty of the cities,
Yeah.
the cities are in decline. Berlin, there are parts of Berlin that are quite dirty, squatters, homeless. It's a change. It's a big change in a short period of time. And that's why you have the polarization in politics. You have a collapse of the center. That is, the Schultz Social Democrats are collapsing. The Green Party has fallen from close to 18, 19% to under 10%, and in some states, 3 and 4%. The Christian Democrats have a guy named Friedrich Merz who comes from BlackRock and who's a big supporter of the war. So you have the so-called opposition extremes, the left party of Sarah Wagenknecht, who I find quite interesting, quite a compelling figure. And then the so-called right extremist party, the Alternative for Deutschland. I have many friends in that party who are quite sane, quite thoughtful. And the two of them are anti-war, anti-green, but they won't organize together. They're kept apart. And so, Germany has no potential to pull together a majority coalition right now. So the same thing in France. Macron was ruling for 6 months without a prime minister. And now he has a prime minister who's totally unpopular. So you see this change overnight in Europe to a polarization and unhappiness. The people are generally unhappy. And when the Germans start protesting, when they give up their passivity, the last time there were protests were in 1989 against the East German dictatorship. Now we're seeing similar movements emerging today. And then, of course, in the United States, the polarization between the Democrats and Republicans on certain issues, although on the big issues, if you take Trump out, because Trump is opposed to the Ukraine war, but most of the Republicans are side by side with the Democrats in supporting the military and the wars, the permanent war policy.
Let me ask you, getting back to Germany, the Schultz, and he's just the latest example of the German leadership seems to be on some very tight puppet strings. And it appears, to my perspective, that it is NATO that is calling the plays, and that this NATO Atlantic Council and then all of the Wall Street and City of London money working together has so far been effective to keep that puppet show going while looting the actual country of Germany of its money, its industry, its culture, and its livability. And
Yeah.
so in terms of a solution, going out on the streets may be the worst thing they could do, because it's just going to justify more totalitarian measures as the crowds get bigger. Certainly, the powers that be are going to impose something like they have done here in the United States, and just abolished our free election system, and with barbed wire fences last time. It's a dangerous thing. But anyway, do you agree with me as far as who's holding the hammer over their heads, and what do you think is really the way forward for Germany?
Well, let's go back a little bit to see how that happened, because after Germany became reunited in 1989, 1990, and don't forget, 1989, there were people in the streets, and it started small, 100 people who gathered on several Sunday demonstrations, Monday demonstrations in Leipzig. Pretty soon grew to 10,000. And when the East German government decided to crack down, it was too late. It turned out to be 100,000. And it brought down the Berlin Wall. Now, at that point, there was an opportunity for Germany as a reunited country to take the benefits of West Germany and extend them to East Germany. Instead, they looted East Germany the same way they looted Russia under Yeltsin.
Oh.
And so what they did is they created a divided society. And it's not a surprise that in Eastern Germany, the votes are going against Scholz and against his coalition. Now, after Helmut Kohl left, and then Schroeder, you had Merkel. And Merkel was basically a placekeeper. But the reason it worked under Merkel was because of cheap Russian energy. And the cheap energy enabled the industry to continue to grow. And it meant cheap utilities. It meant the after-tax income of the population was higher than it was in other European countries because of the Russian energy policy. Now, when Scholz came in, we had the Ukraine war and the US sanctions. Now, the Germans didn't protest one bit. So to get to your point about NATO, it's the US, London, and NATO dictating policy to Germany. And the proof of that is that when the Nord Stream pipeline was coming online, Trump acted against it, and then Biden blew it up. And I think the reporting from Seymour Hersh is accurate on that it was the United States that did it. Now, what did that mean? That meant Germany no longer had cheap, affordable electricity, energy for industry. And so what kept Merkel somewhat popular isn't there for Scholz. And Scholz's cabinet is a bunch of extremists. You have Lindner from the Free Democratic Party, who is opposed to any government expenditures. You have the Greens, who want government expenditures for the green transition, which means a deindustrialization of Germany. And then Scholz, who seemed to have some of the competence of Schroeder, instead bent completely to the NATO policy of the war. And so that's where things stand. Now, Friedrich Merz of the CDU is the ahead in the polls, but Merz has absolutely the same policy, the anti-Russia, anti-China policy, pro-European Union policy of Scholz. And that's why we see the so-called left and the right growing and the center shrinking. And that's a prescription for a serious problem, especially because the media is insisting there can be no coalition of left and right, that you have to keep people fighting against each other. It's an example in Germany of the identity politics in the United States. And so then you add to that the control of the foreign policy by the geopoliticians of the European Union and NATO, who follow the Brzezinski line. And I just wrote a longer article on this. It'll be in the Executive Intelligence Review this week on the question of what is the collective Biden. Now, this is interesting. The term the Russians use for the Biden administration is collective Biden, by which they mean the physical character of Joe Biden isn't making policy anymore. We've seen his incompetence, his breakdown. So who's making policy? Harris? Of course not. So what I did is I focused on Blinken and the crowd around Blinken, which is a walking interface of the corporate conglomerates that are military, defense, finance, insurance. The clients of his firm, West Exec Advisors, when he was out of government, which includes Lazard Frere, Bank of America, Palantir, Boeing. That's who's running the government. And Blinken is the pathetic salesman for their policies. And I refer to him as the Willy Loman of foreign policy, reference to the character in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, who thinks he's popular, thinks he's powerful, and yet when he leaves a meeting, people are laughing at him. Blinken, I couldn't believe it. After the most recent round of bloodletting by the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces in northern Gaza and Lebanon, just slaughter. He went to Israel to meet with Netanyahu, and he said, now because of your great success in the war against Hamas, we can build on these successes. It's an opportunity for peace. Well, the opportunity for peace was there from October 8th forward, but he didn't want peace. The people controlling Blinken wanted war. They wanted disruption. They wanted geopolitics. And so to describe the Israeli murder of the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah, the killing of over 40,000 civilians as successes, I think the rest of the world looked at that in horror. How can this guy go around the world talking about peace when he's delivering the weapons that are killing children? So, when you look at that, you see the horror of the Western establishment. And that's the same establishment that dictates policy to Schultz, to Macron, to Meloni in Italy, to Starmer in Britain, to Zelensky in Ukraine. And they're the ones who say that any attempt to break up their policy is an existential threat to the West. So in other words, they look at the BRICS summit, which just took place in Kazan, Russia, where the BRICS added to their members. They talked about new platforms of exchange and economic settlement and so on. This is seen as a threat to the West as opposed to an opportunity to break out of this imperial paradigm. So that's the problem in the West, and there's no one who's talking about it.
Yeah, I want to get into the BRICS summit with you, but before I get too deep in it, I've been thinking a lot about Henry Kissinger lately, and going back to him opening China with Gerald Ford, standing in the background, approving all this on behalf of the American people. And opening China, it just was the beginning of a surge in Chinese industrialization. And, I don't have the facts on my fingertips, but suffice to say, China today, I would think would not be as incredibly successful were it not for Henry Kissinger's efforts to open China to Western investment. And with that in mind, is it not more likely that the BRICS is simply another side of the greater globalization project, in which now they've been able to bundle all of these countries together, so that now they've just almost got it down to two big bundles that they can push together, either with war or with compromise or otherwise, to form that one world government and one world financial system that I think has been the real driving force behind everything that we've been experiencing lately. So that's my big question about the BRICS, is how much of this is just another Henry Kissinger play on the other side of the world, and does it not all trace back once again to Sir Henry's involvement in Chatham House and the City of London?
Well, let me deconstruct your theory a little bit by starting by saying Kissinger was not intending to have an industrial development of China. He was committed to bringing China on the U.S. side against Russia, pitting China and Russia against each other, which he said repeatedly.
Okay.
Because he was also involved with so-called détente with Russia, with the Soviet Union. So Kissinger was a true British imperial puppet. And what he was trying to do was to create in China a source of cheap labor for U.S. industry, while building China up as a counter to the Soviet Union. So you continue to have a post-war neo-Cold War division. Now, the problem was that the Chinese were clever. Deng Xiaoping was quite a clever guy, and they used the initial input from Western industry to advance their own engineering and technical capabilities. And by creating their own industrial base and a modernization of agriculture and then an investment in infrastructure, to not just provide profits to Western corporations, but increasingly to keep the wealth produced for developing a middle class in China, which they've done. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty after the Kissinger World Trade Organization policy enabled China to industrialize or to escalate their industrial policy. Furthermore, they leaped ahead of us in certain areas of technology, as has Russia in terms of at least military capabilities. Now, so what Kissinger intended with the World Trade Organization was to open the world to Chinese goods, the supply chain to Chinese goods, but certainly not with the intent of improving China's industrial capability or military capability. And that was just the case of the Chinese saying, we're not going to play your game. Now,
well, wait a minute. What kind of Chinese goods could we want to buy if they were not industrialized?
Well, we wouldn't.
Right.
So China was able to take advantage of the offer from Kissinger and the World Trade Organization. But what I'm saying is that instead of just keeping cheap labor, they started increasing their salaries and improving their standard of living. But they were growing rapidly enough that they could incorporate, take the wealth that was being produced to improve the conditions of their population. Now, that was one miscalculation of Kissinger and the World Trade Organization. Secondly, on this question of globalization, the globalization should not be a dirty word. What's a dirty word is the unipolar order using globalization to loot countries. But we do have a global economy. No country is totally self-sufficient and needs goods and can benefit from scientific and technological advances in other countries. The question is, will globalization be based on cooperation among sovereign states or a unipolar superpower controlling the economy of the rest of the world for the benefit of the billionaire class? Right. So globalization itself is not dirty. It's how it's used. And now that's why the idea of a one world order that Kissinger wanted, that Brzezinski wanted, that the British geopoliticians want, it's based on suppressing sovereignty in the rest of the world so that nations are not able to act for their own interests, and they're not able to combine with other countries for mutual benefit. That world is ending. That's what the BRICS represent. Now, the BRICS countries don't agree on everything. We saw that in Kazan. There were disagreements on certain things, how fast to move toward a new settlement system. Will we replace the dollar? There are a number of questions that were left unresolved. What was important was it was a process in which all the member countries could be heard and participate and raise their questions and objections and carry on a dialogue, which you're not allowed to do under a unipolar order. The so-called rules-based order of the Willy Loman character Blinken basically says, these are the rules, you obey them or we crush you, with sanctions, with war, with assassination, regime change, and so on. The global South is now saying that world no longer exists. We're not going to accept your authority. We are sovereign nations. And now that can be backed up by the military power of Russia and China, the overall economic growth potential of China and India in particular, And so you have a global system which is not based on destruction of sovereignty. That's why this argument that the BRICS was really invented by this guy from Goldman Sachs. I mean, what he recognized was something that anyone should have been able to recognize, which is that between India, China, and Russia, there would be growth rates that would pretty soon challenge the level of growth and GDP in the advanced sector. And therefore, there's a potential power shift to those countries. Now, the question is, what Goldman Sachs wanted was to make sure they controlled it. They're not controlling it. City of London is not controlling the BRICS. And this is why Putin is being so careful not to rush into a system, not to de-dollarize to the point that it creates a potential aggressive West out to destroy the BRICS, which they're trying to do. The West is trying to undermine the BRICS, but Putin is going slowly, step by step, and they're saying repeatedly to Europe and the United States, why don't you cooperate with us, participate with us, so we can have a world of sovereign states that work together, but one is not the power over the others, but every nation has an opportunity to participate for justice and fairness. So I hear from Americans who are frightened by the idea that the de-dollarization means the destruction of America. That's not being done by Russia or China. That's being done by US politicians, by the economic policies coming from Wall Street and London.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. I want to fine tune a little bit on this, how the BRICS are going to maintain individual sovereign nations. And we've talked about this many times, Harley, like the quote from Horace Rowan Gaither about how what we need to do is to rise up the level of economy or income in the Soviet Union to a level with that of America, and then to lower the American level to that compatible with the Soviet Union in the 50s, which was a very drastic difference at the time. But it looks to me like they've gotten a lot closer, if that's the people behind the scenes goal. And the issue then is exactly what we often talk about, is that the elites want to take the economy and lift it above sovereign governments, so that no matter what the sovereign governments do, and they can regulate their policies with regard to other issues, or they can do their domestic lawmaking and all. But if the situation right now with the dollar being, having hegemony in almost all of the economies of the world, then you change it to some currency that the BRICS come up with, and we saw Putin holding a little play money example of such money. Then the currency is going to float across borders, whether it's in that half of the world or the Western half of the world, dollars or BRICS money. It's not going to be under the control of sovereign governments, and just as it has not been for most of our lifetimes. So in order to preserve sovereignty, does not a government have to control at least its currency, or at least have some currency control so that it can regulate the economy within the country? Or are we looking at being swept under this world currency system that's going to have absolutely no consideration for local values, for the decisions of governments, because the economy has been successfully divorced from government control?
Well, look, that's the danger, but that's why Putin's moving slowly. That's why Putin is saying we have to move in step by step, and we have to resolve some of these questions first. But if you start with the idea that sovereign governments have a right to control their own credit system, which doesn't exist right now, The credit system internationally is controlled by 5 major banks, by the central banks of the European countries and the US. And these central banks are controlled by the largest private banks, especially the ones that are called too big to fail. They have had a monopoly on credit generation since the end of the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
Now, initially, because of the role of a gold reserve system, there had to be some ultimate settlement system in which you couldn't just print money. You had to have some basis for extending credit. And countries were not allowed to do that without the International Monetary Fund controlling them and telling them what they could spend and not spend. And the IMF was essentially committed to preventing sovereignty. I mean, Walt Wriston of Citibank wrote a book called The Twilight of Sovereignty. This is what Brzezinski's technocratic or technotronic era is about. You have technocrats who work largely on behalf of the special private interests of the largest financial institutions, controlling credit, not nations. Now, what Putin is saying is that we want to give nations the autonomy to make their own economic decisions based on what's needed for their country. And this will differ from place to place based on the imbalances of economic advance or in poverty. But how do you change that? Well, you create a trading system and a system of transfer so that countries that are poor nevertheless have a capability to generate internal credit without being attacked by the private banks to weaken their currency the way Soros did with the Asian economies in 1998. So you set up an interim policy, which will include the dollar, because there's no way they can get rid of the dollar that quickly. And they don't have a new currency set to go. But what they are using in the short term is national currencies. That is, they're allowing countries to buy and sell using their own national currencies and figuring out a legitimate peg to the other currencies. So that's what you have with the ruble and the rupee. That's what you have with the yuan and the Saudi petrodollars. You know, the Saudis are accepting Chinese currency now for their oil instead of having it to be transferred into dollars. Now, if that happens with every country, that they can use their own currency in the short term, it raises the question of what must they do to make sure their currency has some value. Well, the only way to do that is to have productive wealth being produced by that economy, so there's something to back up the currency. In some cases, you can use raw materials. For example, African countries that have no dollar reserves but have huge amounts of raw materials that the West needs can use those raw materials as the basis of their currency. So in other words, it's not dependent on going to New York City or London to trade something for dollars to be able to use the dollars to make purchases. So it's going to take a little while. That's what Putin, that's what Sergei Glaziev is saying. That's what the leading economists of the BRICS are talking about. Nagora, the former deputy New Development Bank chairman, Dilma Rousseff, the former prime minister or president of Brazil, who's the head of the New Development Bank. They're all working on trying to solve this problem, which is a difficult problem to solve. But what they're saying is they're not going to cede their nation's policy to bankers, foreign bankers, who will use the power of the dollar, the weaponization of the dollar, to stop them from investing in infrastructure, education, healthcare, raw material development in their own countries. So this is the rational way out of this crisis. And it means in the short term, forgiving some debt. And this is what Russia and China have been doing with Africa. They're forgiving a certain portion of debt, which the IMF never did. The IMF instead imposed conditions that countries would have to stop investing in their own economy so that all the income they receive from selling goods would go to pay off the bankers. And that's why you have so many of these countries had collapsed economies. The BRICS model says, we're not going to force you into a bankruptcy. We're going to create a situation where you can use the leverage you have, whether it's raw materials, a labor force, developing industrial sector, whatever it is, you can use that as the basis of credit for future investment. And that will ensure that your currency has some value. And at that point, you can then start talking about, will there be a shift from the dollar to some other global currency? But it will be determined based on the solvency of the member nations as opposed to the power of private banks.
I admire the goals. I admire the effort. I'm glad to see it all. I'm just very concerned about the details and the other. I mean, I don't know. I guess we're getting pretty deep into the weeds, but I can't imagine there not having to be some trade protections for the small undeveloped countries, to protect
there
them.
will be.
So-
There has to be. That's part of the American system, John. The idea that in order for these nations to develop their own industries, they're going to need some protection. But why is that a threat to the average person in Des Moines, Iowa, or Las Vegas, Nevada?
No,
why is it a threat to Americans if countries decide they are going to start going through the process of their own internal economic development?
I think it's a threat to those that want to work outside the system, like an oligarch who would say, all those resources down in Burundi, I'd really like to have them, and so I think I'm just going to make sure that the government does what I say. And how do you stop an oligarch unless you ultimately lock him up?
Well, that's a different question, because
Okay, fair
now
enough.
you're talking about the corruption of the West, of saying we're going to determine what you have of value and what you can do to monetize your resources in a monetary system, as opposed to a nation saying we're not going to let you come in and loot us anymore. Now, the problem comes down to this. The oligarchs control the US military and NATO. And so up to this point, any nation that tried to do something to protect their population, any government that tried to protect their population, could be overthrown, assassination, color revolution, regime change, and so on. What happens when the United States is so overextended that it's not capable of intervening in every place, or if it does intervene, it runs up against Russia, China, India, Brazil, and other countries? What would happen if the German industrialists, who are acknowledging that they're suffering terribly under the European Union policies of NATO and the United States, what would happen if the industrialists stepped forward and said to the Germans, we're going to run on a platform of collaborating with the BRICS and breaking with the NATO consensus, the Washington consensus? What would happen if Germany did that? Well, it wouldn't take long before France would join them. Italy would join them. Some of the Eastern European countries are already on that track. What happens then if you have major NATO allies say, we're not going to fight wars to defend a bankrupt system anymore? Is the US going to go it alone? Now, that's why it's important that the people who run the Biden-Harris policy be defeated. And it's not that I think Trump has all the solutions, but I think that breaking the control of the collective Biden, of the Wall Street, City of London forces that control the US and use the US as a bully to keep the unipolar order going, if you change that, we're in a totally different situation in the world. Now, this is not some kind of idealism or utopian view, we're already seeing it work. There's been an attempt to strong arm the Indians to break with Russia and to use the India-China confrontation to keep them from working together. The day before the BRICS conference, it was announced that India and China had made a breakthrough 20 years in the making to resolve the border conflict that they have.
That's good.
And this was an extraordinary moment when Modi and Xi Jinping stood together before the BRICS and said, we're working on solving this. We're not going to have a war over the border. Now, the policy of Blinken and of the British was to push for a China-India confrontation, to pull India out of the BRICS. And Modi said, look, we don't agree with moving away from the dollar, at least at this point, but we don't want to be in a situation where the dollar can be weaponized against India. And so this is how we're seeing nations stand up. Even the smaller countries like Mali and poor countries like Niger are saying, look, we have certain raw materials. Niger has uranium. We're not going to let you come in and steal our uranium. We want just return for our products. And if you won't do it for us, we'll sell it to Russia and China. So we're seeing that kind of shift. Now, the problem is that the Western establishment is prepared to go to war to protect the existing order. But what we're finding is that unless they're willing to go to a nuclear war, which risks the whole civilization, they're not prepared to fight the wars that they're stuck with. The idea that they could use Ukraine to defeat Russia, they now are clear that that's not going to work. U.S. military people are telling Biden and Harris and others that we cannot continue to support an Israeli genocide that because Iran is stronger than most people think, and Israel is weaker. On top of that, the U.S. is running out of weapons surplus to provide Ukraine and Israel. So we're reaching a certain boundary condition where the old imperial geopolitics no longer works. And unless you're prepared to go to tactical nuclear weapons and nuclear war, which the Pentagon is not. The Pentagon told Biden, or whoever runs Biden, not to give permission to Zelensky to fire long-range missiles into Russia. And that's what happened on September 13th when Blinken had finished this tour with Lamy, the British foreign secretary. They met with Zelensky, then they came with Starmer to meet with Biden on September 13th to get Biden to sign on to letting Zelensky shoot long-range Storm Shadow missiles and U.S. missiles deep into Russia. And Biden said, no, we're not going to do it. And then a week later at the UN, Biden again said no. And so that wasn't Biden, that was the military of the United States, some of the saner people saying we're not ready for a nuclear war. We don't want to have a nuclear war with Russia. Now, that kind of change is a step in the right direction. And the problem is that no one in the United States knows about these kinds of fights that are going on. They don't know what the BRICS represent. And so they're being scared that somehow we're going to lose the dollar, we're going to be turned against by the rest of the world. The reality is the rest of the world is turning against the policies of the United States because these policies don't represent the interests of the American people, but the oligarchs. So the fight we have is to take power away from the oligarchy. And there was an interesting moment after the BRICS summit. One of my colleagues who was there as a representative had a discussion with, let me see if I can find it, with a leader of with an advisor to Putin, an advisor whose name was Kobyakov. And we asked him, do you think there's a possibility that the West would be willing to collaborate with the BRICS? And Kobyakov said, We hope very much for that. Our president, Putin, talks about that always. The main thing he said is that Pax Americana, namely the unipolar order, if it collapses, the main thing is that when it collapses, we don't want it to bury all of us under the rubble. So they're basically saying, why not take the path of joining with us, if not necessarily joining the BRICS, but cooperating with the BRICS? So the Russians are hoping that something like that would happen, just as they were hoping in the 90s to be brought in as partners with the West. And Clinton kept telling Yeltsin, yes, you're our partner, we're going to work with you, even as we sent bankers in to loot Russia. So the burden, the onus is on the Western countries. And that means the people of the West have to stand up and say, no more looting, no more imperialism, no more neocolonialism.
That's not happening this election, I'll tell you.
No, it's not. But
people of this country are polarized and basically very terrified of one another. And the hints from people like Jamie Raskin that even if Trump wins, there will be a fight, because they've already declared that Trump is not eligible because of his anti-democratic support of the J6 events, which they are still convinced was run by Trump and not by Pelosi. So these people are nutty enough and oligarchically driven, as you say, to pull the lever on something if they don't win the election, and that keeps everybody rather jumpy, because the only thing we have that keeps America together right now is the election. And in my opinion, we all have to vote just to make sure that the system of voting doesn't fall apart, because if that falls apart, then we really are becoming serfs in the service of various oligarchs. Harley,
John, let me give your viewers a moment of hope. On Saturday in New York City, we had an extraordinary event. It was the combined efforts of two independent candidates, Diane Sayre, who's running for Senate in New York, and Jose Vega, who's in the 15th Congressional District, the Bronx, both running as independent candidates for Congress. Now, speaking at that event was a broad cross-section of the political establishment, or not I'd say the anti-establishment. Scott Ritter spoke, Garland Nixon spoke, Ray McGovern spoke, Lawrence Wilkerson spoke, Andrea McArdle, the head of the Libertarian Party, spoke. There were a number of other speakers. I was invited to speak at that, and so Helga Zepp-LaRouche spoke. And what was the central topic? We're committing suicide if we don't break out of this geopolitical doctrine. And that the potential that the BRICS showed is an opening for the West to move away from confrontation and provocation into cooperation. And to really drive this point home, and this is something that I know you would appreciate, we interspersed between the speakers classical music, whether it was a Dvorak string quartet, a Bach canon, Negro spirituals, songs from South Africa, from Palestine, from China. The idea that there's a universal quality of human creativity that exists in all nations. And instead of aspiring to be a sole hegemon controlling that, we ought to recognize the legitimate security and development interests of every nation. And Scott Ritter made an interesting point. The topic was a chorus of peace to defeat the ghouls of war. And Scott started out by saying, I never thought I would be standing in front of a concert with someone like Diane Sayre against the ghouls of war, because I'm a ghoul of war. And he talked about his military background, his sense of you have to fight for your policy. But then he started talking about how this is what they're talking about here makes sense. And urge people to watch. I mean, it's a 3-hour event, so you need a lot of time, or at least take some time to watch various sections of it. But to see what the future could be like if the American people realize that we're being used not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of a handful of billionaires. And when you hear people as different as Garland, Nixon, and Andrea McArdle speaking about this, or you see Jose Vega, who's a product of the poor Bronx, the immigrant families there, speaking so eloquently about cooperation and development. And what Jimmy Dore said is that Jose Vega is an inspiration to him, and that's why he called on people to back Diane and Jose. So, they're not going to win their elections, but what they're speaking for is the real interest, the self-interest of every American. And our fight is to make sure our voice is heard, because otherwise we're headed toward nuclear war. So given those options, I think people should find the time to watch the video, share the video, and start talking about how the U.S. has to change its policy and at least cooperate with the BRICS. And that's the hope that we tried to leave the conference with.
And bravo to all involved, including yourself, who came over from Europe to participate in this and other things, Harley. And I love the approach with the music and everything. And if I lived closer to New York City, you can bet I'd be in that chorus that Diane.
We might have invited you, to join the chorus and maybe even sing something.
Well, I would, as I said, I am just thrilled to know Diane. We talk some offline and have got a nice personal relationship. I respect her immensely, and she's by far the best candidate for Senate in the state of New York. And Jose Vega, my God, I mean, this is a very, very talented man, and don't try to tell him he's not going to win. He's going to win. I mean, I'm serious. I have a Jose Vega hat, and I am very proud to wear it. And I am very proud of that man. And God bless him and his campaign in the Bronx. He's a tiger, and I don't know. He might very well pull something off that will get him and your movement a lot of attention. He's a terrific fighter for what he believes in, and so I'm really, really pleased to have him on my show, and Diane has been on so many times, and this is a message of peace that everybody should participate in. I would like to just thank you for so many wonderful shows we've had together over the years, Harley, and I like to pick into things because it helps me learn. I would say the big takeaway today is that the U.S. is run by oligarchs. The West is run by oligarchs, because most of us think of oligarchs in terms of Igor Kolomoisky and the Ukrainian oligarchs and the Russian oligarchs and the ones, with the Russian mafia and the hitmen and all that. But the West is run by the same type of organization with the same type of murdering.
The West created those Russian oligarchs with the shock therapy policy of the 1990s.
There you go. All right. So, folks, that's what you take away from our show together today.
And John, if you could just post the link that I sent you for the concert, the conference, so that people can download it and watch it.
I will put it up right after the show in the show notes. And folks, definitely watch that video. And if you haven't heard Scott Ritter speak yet, you're in for a real treat. He's a powerful speaker. And of course, you all know Jimmy Dore and the other folks. Garland, terrific, and always lively. And what a fast brain Garland has. And he's terrific. So watch that. I'll post it after the show. And Harley, any closing thoughts?
Just don't despair. As terrible as this election campaign has become, The hope is with the American people and our constitutional tradition. And we have to not just pay homage to it, we have to live it. We have to become an embodiment of the idea that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And if we live that, we won't be suckered into the polarized situation that's been set up to prevent us from realizing our real destiny.
Thank you again, Harley Schlanger, and we will see you right here in 2 weeks. We'll be talking in retrospect about the election at that time, and I can't wait. Bye now.
Okay, see you then.